Almost every country on the Atlantic coast had a colonial empire. Yes, even countries like Poland, Lithuania, Brandenburg, Prussia, and of course, Scotland. Out of the three countries mentioned, Scotland is one with the most famous colonial empire, having a number of small colonies in the Americas, the most famous of which was New Caledonia in the modern-day Darien in Panama. New Caledonia was established by William Patterson, a man with an eye for strategic geographic choke points. He saw that Darien as a place where the Scottish could ferry goods between the Atlantic and Pacific. The wealth from such a colony would make Scotland a very wealthy country, a dream that the kingdom wished to be true, as Scotland was involved in a period of famine and general decline known as the L times in the 1690s. The colony ultimately failed, primarily because everything went wrong. Disease struck the settlement, the natives refused to trade with the Scots, agriculture was impossible due to the region's geography, and local leadership was weak due to internal competition between the elected officials. The Spanish also blockaded the settlement and forced them to abandon the colony. The fatal blow to the colony was when King William III of England, who Scotland was in a personal union with, forbade trade between the various English possessions in the New World with New Caledonia. As shown by colonies like Jamestown, even with all the obstacles listed above, colonies could still have survived with supply ships. However, William III did not recognize the Scottish colony as legitimate and thus forbade the trade. This ultimately left the Scottish colony to die. The economic effect was massive, as up to half of Scottish capital was invested into the colony. The economic fallout ultimately resulted in the 1707 Acts of Union that united the Kingdom of Scotland and England into the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Scottish colony in Darien has fascinated the minds of many since the downfall. It's interesting to ponder about the Scots having a crucial colony in the Americas. So, what would exactly occur if New Caledonia survived? How will that affect history, borders, and the like? In this video, we will explore that question. I'm your host, Pursuit96, and welcome back to another alternate history video. As said, the primary reason New Caledonia failed was because the English forbid trade with it. Plenty of colonies like Jamestown have been able to survive on situations on par or worse than that of New Caledonia. The difference is that these colonies can receive aid from the mainland or nearby colonies, ultimately keeping them alive. New Caledonia did not have that. With William III declaring the colony illegitimate, it ultimately meant that trade was prohibited, thus resulting in the abandonment of the colony. So, why did William III forbid trade with the colonies? I think it was because of a policy dubbed Old Subsidy. This policy gave certain imported colonial products a near monopoly in England, particularly sugar, which was given an imperial preference. However, with Scotland technically being separate from England, this would mean that the preferential trading system wouldn't apply, which was a no-no. So, Scottish colonies were declared illegitimate, and thus trade was prohibited. Some might say that the theory is not logical, since the Netherlands, the home country of King William III, was also in union with England, but trade was still occurring between the two. I would just like to say that this is an excellent critique. However, I would still like to explain my point. The Netherlands and England had come under union in 1688, following the Glorious Revolution. Prior to this, England and the Netherlands had engaged in numerous conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, where England attempted to militarily subdue the Dutch Republic. So, when the stadtholder William of Orange and his wife, Mary II, came to power in England, it was in their best interest to encourage cooperation between the English and Dutch, and that included trade. This had the short-term effect of ceasing war between the English and Dutch. However, in the long run, it ultimately shifted the global dominance of trade away from the Dutch to the English and later the British. And this impetus to encourage trade between the English and Dutch did not exist for Scotland and England, and so trade was forbidden between the English colonies and the Scottish colony. So, how to get this impetus to be added to Scotland? Well, Scotland and England have had a tense history between each other. Maybe the English would fear that Scotland would be used as a French base for a French invasion of England, especially with the War of Spanish Succession, when France and Spain basically fought with the rest of Europe. Not to mention that Scotland and the French were natural allies since they hated the English. Maybe through this fear, they would encourage greater cooperation between the Scots and the English to diminish any willingness from the Scottish to ally with the French in the war and thus not forbid trade with New Caledonia, thus keeping the colony alive enough to become self-sustaining. Now that we have created a permanent Scottish settlement in the Darien, we will now explore its effects. The Scottish colony in the Darien would bring in trade. The colony would likely be ran by merchants who would have a better understanding of global trade than the nearby Spanish, ultimately shifting center of trade from Panama City to New Edinburgh. Also, the Spanish War of Succession would mean that the merchants seeking to enter the Atlantic or Pacific would go south to New Caledonia, since Scotland was neutral in the war, and most of the powers involved were belligerents against the Spanish in the war. Spanish also had a preferential trading system similar to that of the English, resulting in trade with other colonies and countries being forbidden, contrast to the free trade that was promoted in the Darien. A bigger question is that would Scotland still enter a recession? The answer is yes, but it would be far less devastating than our timeless recession. When efforts have half your economies invested into such a project, a recession is inevitable. However, the benefits of being a global center of trade will ultimately aid the Scottish economy in the long run. Ultimately, we're resulting in no acts of union. The acts of union could have only really occurred with the failure of New Caledonia, with the vast majority of Scots favoring a mere personal union rather than a full union. In our timeline, the English bribed the Scottish nobility into accepting legislation on the promise that the English would offer compensation for the losses following the Darien colony. Even then, the Acts of Union only barely passed in the Scottish Parliament, and with the losses from the recession being mitigated in this timeline, it would have never passed. There were other reasons the English wanted the Union, such as fear that the Scottish Parliament would elect the Jacobite line, or the descendants of King James II, who had been disposed in the Glorious Revolution, to be kings of Scotland. These factors would have either been mitigated, would never existed, or wouldn't matter. Scotland would remain independent in this timeline. With greater cooperation between the British kingdoms and with the Scottish and Spanish likely being rivals of the Darien colony, Scotland would probably join the War of Spanish Succession as part of the anti-Franco-Spanish coalition. It would primarily get involved in the Queen Anne's War, or the North American theater of the conflict, and seize Panama. The presence in the Americas from the European powers during this war was a joke and was primarily ragtag militias organized by common folk fighting amongst each other. The European powers didn't really focus on this front, and so Scotland that focused primarily on this front would probably be victorious. The Scottish entry into the war otherwise wouldn't really affect this war. However, with the various treaties that concluded the conflict, Spain would have been humiliated enough to give the Scottish enough bargaining power to negotiate a full annexation of Panama and possibly even more, with Spain's position as a global power effectively ceasing after the conflict. So, what would life in the Darien be like? The lowlands of Panama would probably become a majority black, with the Scottish importing slaves to harvest cash crops such as sugar and cocoa. The highlands of Panama would have a climate more conducive to that of the Europeans, and thus become majority white. Being mountainous, the economy of these regions would be based around herding and small-scale agriculture. The colony in Darien was not the only colonial endeavor Scotland wished to endure. The Company of Scotland, officially the Company of Scotland trading in Africa and the Indies, sought to colonize Africa and India. However, the exact location of these colonies are never disclosed. In Africa, the Scottish would, in my opinion, colonize parts of the Sahel or Congo and get more involved in the slave trade, shipping slaves to the Americas. In India, meanwhile, the Scottish would likely get involved in the eastern India, the west already being tapped by various European powers. With greater cooperation between the English and Scottish, a British Raj-like state would probably still emerge, so more of a union between the English and Scottish territories. Being a larger, more powerful, and more important power, the English would acquire the lion's share of India, while the Scottish would acquire a decent amount of land, as India would tumble to British control. Obviously, the Scottish would colonize regions besides India and Africa. They had plans for other colonies in the Americas. However, like Africa and India, the exact location is never specified. They would likely get involved in the Caribbean, likely smuggling slaves into the colonies and conducting raids against Spanish colonial possessions in attempt to seize them and benefit from the lucrative sugar trade. Perhaps the 7 Years' Black War would be sparked to the Scottish conflict in this region. However, I put this as less likely than likely. Meanwhile, in the Lesser Antilles, or the eastern archipelago within the Caribbean, there are still a few islands that have not been claimed by any European power, and so the Scottish would likely seize them in this timeline. For those of you who may question how realistic that would be, people thought that Brandenburg Prussia and Poland Lithuania had colonies in this region. So it is possible, or actually probable, that the Scottish would make similar efforts here. Patterson was a man with an eye for geographic choke points, and so would have probably looked elsewhere for critical trade choke points that could be claimed by the Scottish. There was only one major center of trade that hadn't been claimed by European power: the Straits of Malacca, which controlled the entire trade between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, while still under the control of the native Sultanate of Johor. The Scottish would likely build forts and trading posts in Singapore to control the trade between the two oceans, as well as also to compete against the Dutch, based out of Indonesia, who would likely attempt to stifle Scottish as well as English trade in the region, like they did in our timeline. Over time, the Scots, based out of Singapore, likely absorbed much of Malaysia, Sumatra, and possibly even portions of Borneo, and maybe even expand up north to Indochina. However, I believe that the latter is somewhat unlikely. Also, colonial policy in the English would determine a lot as well. The English possibly preventing the Scottish movement into Indochina. The money from this past colonial empire would flow into Scotland. This would have several effects. Firstly, it makes Scotland a wealthy nation. In our timeline, Scotland has been historically been quite poor due to the geography. This had the effect of making Scotland a minor power in Europe. This would not be the case in this timeline, with Scotland controlling two major geographic choke points and being involved in the lucrative sugar trade and slave trade, as well as India. Scotland would solidify itself as a major European power, projecting its influence across the globe. Secondly, the wealth in this empire, as well as being a powerful state, would mean that the Scottish desire for full independence from the English would even be greater. In our timeline, Scotland was a subordinate nation in their personal union with England, despite the fact that the Stuart dynasty was originally from Scotland. Scotland was poor and really wasn't that critical to European politics, while England was the opposite. This made it fairly easy for the English to subjugate the Scottish. In this timeline, Scotland would be a highly wealthy nation, and a major player, would increasingly come to despise their English overlord. However, England would still be a far greater power than Scotland, meaning that no major pro-independence events would occur until the 19th century. In our timeline, in 1715 and 1745, James Francis Edward Stuart, or the Old Pretender, and his son Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charles, rose up in revolt against the Jacobite Rising of 1715 and 1745 respectively. They were the direct descendants of King James II, who had been deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and attempted to restore his line to the throne. Bonnie Prince Charles' revolt is a more famous revolt. During the Austrian War of Succession, the French supported a Jacobite revolt that were led by Bonnie Prince Charles to preoccupy the British. They occupied Scotland and made some gains in England, but were forced to turn back due to no signs of the French invasion, and wars at the hand of the regime would never collapse even if London was seized. They retreated and were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Culloden. The French backed this revolt because they thought the British expansion of trade following the War of the Spanish Succession as a threat to the European balance of power, and saw the Jacobite cause as a way to mitigate it, partially since the Scottish dissented the loss of power following the Acts of Union. In this timeline, however, with the Scotland becoming independent and allied to England, and perhaps being as much of an economic threat as the English, the French would have never triggered the revolt. The defeat at Culloden resulted in a mass destruction of Highlander culture by the English, since they made up the bulk of the Jacobite army during the uprising. Things like kilts and magpies were banned, and the clan structure that predominated in the Highlands was destroyed. The destruction of the latter ultimately resulted in a mass exodus outward by the Scottish peasantry to the various British colonies. With no Jacobite uprising, the Highlands would be more populated and retain its clan structure and culture. However, due to long-term factors such as industrialization, mass exodus would still occur, although it would be primarily mitigated to Scottish colonies and would be far smaller. Scotland, like in this timeline, would industrialize, and actually with the stronger merchant class, would have industrialized far earlier. This would ultimately result in a mass migration to the cities from rural Scotland. This would have had the effect of weakening the Highlander clan structure, as people in the Highlands would flock to the cities and interact with other clans. Despite this, without the typical destruction of the clan structure by the English, it would probably still be around in a simple form in parts of the islands. This timeline is so large and epic that I have to divide it into two parts, and so stay tuned for What If New Caledonia Survived, Part 2. Thank you for watching. Consider liking and sharing this video, and subscribing if you haven't. If you like this video, you may like my video more by Colonial America. As always, thank you for watching and have a marvelous day.